Michael, I want to welcome you to our service today. I've known Mike a long time, and I would say he is the founder of RAWtools, and we're going to hear about that in a minute. He he is the founder of RAWtools, which converts guns into garden tools, and he is a Mennonite and a Mennonite pastor, and his wife is a Mennonite, and she works with immigrants, but she also is doing some school board activism right now. And so Marta and I are very blessed to know Mike and Hannah Martin. And I want to just begin our time together with telling you that before the inauguration in 2016, in January of 2016, Mike and Fred, his dad, and I went to Washington, D.C. to organize against the death penalty with Mike's friend Shane Claiborne, with whom he wrote a book called Beating Guns. And we were there. And I think one morning, it was a quiet morning. I think it was like a Monday morning or a Tuesday morning. We went to the Lincoln Memorial, and the three of us were looking out the Lincoln Memorial. And I've looked out that view many times because I used to work there in DC. But Fred, who is also a Mennonite, right, Mike? Fred's a Mennonite.
Yeah.
Fred looks out. We're looking at all these marble, all this granite, all this power. And he says, how different from Christ's table, where the poor and the homeless and the lost and the confused gather around in welcome and belonging. How different these monuments look from that. I have long admired these two and RAWtools. My wife used to be on the board. So, Mike, I know that this morning you may have, you almost weren't able to join us because your brother-in-law got hit by a car this weekend in Denver. And before we begin, I just wanted to check on him and tell everybody his name and how he is doing, and let us know how we can keep you in our hearts.
Yeah, thanks for that. His name is Ben Myers. You could say he and I married sisters. So my wife is the oldest sister in their family, and he was hit by a car. We're not exactly sure. The driver was the only witness, so we don't know the circumstances, but he has already undergone multiple head and brain surgeries. He's coherent. He's relatively stable, but I would say in a fragile state where he could slip out of being stable at any time. So we would appreciate all the positive energy and healing that you can send his way.
We will do that, Mike. So this is not a partisan event. I think, this is not one side or the other. We could talk about gun safety today and the importance of having a safe, and having your guns locked away. We could talk about all kinds of things. But today I want to just focus on your ministry in the world, Michael, and how you came to it, what it means to you, and what you're trying to accomplish. Years ago, I went to see a pastor named Merv Berkey, and he said to me, Roger, I've got this young adult, and he started this nonprofit called RAWtools. Raw is war backwards. And he's changing guns into garden tools. And I was like, good luck with that. I didn't know Mike at that point. I was like, yeah, that sounds like, something that's not going to ever last. And many years later, here we are. So Mike, tell us about RAWtools and your ministry in the world.
Oh, ye of little faith.
All right. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, so I'm in one of the classrooms at my church that I attend, where my wife is also the children's pastor. And Merv is here, my dad is here too, so it was fun to hear you say their names, and I hope that y'all can sense their presence in what I speak to, because they're a big part of this. I was youth and young adult pastor here for a couple years, and during that time, this idea of turning swords into plowshares really never, I couldn't kick it. I couldn't get it out of my head. I kept thinking about what it might look like in a modern context, and also how in the heck are we going to do it? If I get a gun donated, how are we going to turn it into something else? And so my dad had a friend who grew up as a blacksmith, and we asked him some questions, and we learned how to take the steel in a gun and turn it into a hand tool. And at that point then, I think that's where kind of the rubber met the road, where the implications of turning a sword into a plow or a gun into a garden tool really forces you to look at the systemic influences in our lives that encourage one and how we walk in those spaces. And one of the things that our church has hosted here in the past was a conference for the Pikes Peak Restorative Justice Council. And for those that don't know, one of our elected representatives in Colorado Springs, Pete Lee, has been a champion of getting restorative practices into the legal system in Colorado statewide. He's at the time was a state in the state rep. Now he's a state senator. And I heard a woman speak about her experience of losing her 3-year-old son to a drive-by shooting in the late 90s in Denver, in what many remembers what was called the Summer of Violence. And this forgiveness journey that she would say is never ending. She might have said she forgave the shooter the night it happened without knowing who the shooter was. But she would say that every day she works at that forgiveness, that it's something that she has built in resilience. And the reason I bring her story up is because restorative justice for me filled the hole. Yes, we can turn guns into garden tools. We have to engage the other part of our behavior and the systems and practices and habits that are in place in our society that still encourage us to grab another tool of violence. And so for me, restorative justice did that. And it helped us inform us to build what is our mission statement today, which is to disarm hearts, forge peace, and cultivate justice. And our programs work out of those kind of 3 areas.
Roger, you're on mute.
Sorry, Mike. You mentioned Charlotta, and when we went to DC together, when you were at that Lutheran church on Capitol Hill, and I think you were with the brother of a guy who was executed in Utah or something like that. I can't remember exactly. But talk about how you center the voices, not of Mike Martin and Fred Martin, but you're in the background. You're in a different space, like actually beating guns into garden tools, but you have other people speak. How did you come to that? What is involved in that, and why is that important to you?
Yeah, so from the beginning, built out of restorative justice that is really, if you were to have a dialogue between someone who is harmed and someone who has caused harm, those dialogues don't happen unless the victim or survivor, the person who has caused harm, is asking for it. Another way to say it is that it's victim-centered, that it's never going to happen if it's something that might re-traumatize, re-victimize, or re-harm somebody to go through that. And so we've really placed that kind of as the lens into which we engage all of our work, but especially our public events. And one of the very first events we did, 3 mothers in Philadelphia who had all lost sons to gun violence. And as it happened, one was Christian, one was Jewish, and one was Muslim. And they each shared it happened pretty organically, where it wasn't planned until the event started. But when we hear from these voices who have been affected by gun violence, we're off to the side with our blacksmith station set up, taking a firearm that was turned in from the community that's listening to us and present there with us, and turning it into a garden tool. And that tool will then be given to that community or someone who shared, or a local community garden, as it was in this case. But as each month shared, it was an outdoor event, so we were kind of just off to the side, and it worked out that the flow going up to the mic and leaving the mic was towards our blacksmith station. And my co-author, Shane Claiborne, who host one of that first events, offered to them to take the hammer. And so they walked over to where we were. And in the blacksmithing, right, you have this tong that is holding the hot metal while you have a hammer in the other hand. And so what would happen is they'd come to this anvil, stand on one side, and I would be on the other, and I'd hold the tongs, and they'd hold the hammer. And the last woman who did it, the first 2 mothers came over and hit in silence. And the last mother who came over, she did something that we have incorporated in every one of our events, is to say something while she hit. And if you haven't blacksmithed before, when you hit that hot metal, it was really tough clay. So the first hit, you don't really know how it's going to feel. Is it going to bounce? What's that going to do? It just kind of lands on that metal and puts an impression in it. And then you get more confident as you go. And so as she hammered, she said, "This is for my son." It was this melodic thing that happened. And she kept hammering. So when you're working in blacksmithing, you have to strike while the iron's hot, right? While it's glowing orange, you want to shape that metal into what you want it to be. And when it cools and gets gray, you have to put it back in the forge. And that's usually, 30 seconds or so, which is quite a bit of time when you're doing it. Your arm gets tired if it's much longer. But she kept going after it had cooled off. And you suddenly realized a whole lot of things at once. At the time, I didn't have language for it, but now seeing a trauma-informed lens, that she was physiologically expressing her grief and pain and anger in such a healthy way, as opposed to yelling at someone or punching a wall or throwing an object across the room in this deep pain that she was in. And she had lost her son almost 20 years prior to this. So this was not something new for her, but trauma that she relives every day when she wakes up. And this is true of so many gun violence survivors, that it's really hard to find healthy ways to physiologically express your pain and your grief. If you're connected to somatic healing, that makes a lot of sense, that there's this thing your body has to do, not just your mind and your heart, but that your physical body has to do to help in your healing process. And we have found that this act of picking up the hammer, among other things, has created this safe space for people to release that energy. So we have used that as a prompt for people to say that this space is open for that it is here to receive that. The anvil can receive all that pain. This community can receive all that pain. And it really has also been a really valuable thing for the community that is there and present and witnessing it to receive that as well, to be an anvil for them, to accept this pain, that they are unmoving and there to help shape the people in their community as well. And so we've carried that on to every event. And in that, Charlotta will speak about how she was able to speak that she forgave the person who she would later find out was just a 15-year-old who killed her son, that she had to wait a few events before she could pick up the hammer. She wasn't quite ready. So many survivors will say that whether it's forgiveness or healing, that all on their own timetable, there is no correct timeline for them to get there, but that they have had people in their life that were ready to be with them whenever those times came, support them through that. So it's this moment of transformation where they're not just beating the heck out of something or literally beating the hell out of it, as Reverend Sharon Risher, who lost her mom in the Charleston AME church shooting, said that it felt like she was beating the hell out of the gun, but also releasing the hell of the trauma from her body. And I think that there's this strange transformation that is happening not just in the metal of the gun into a garden tool, but also in this from trauma to hope, or trauma to healing, or pain to life, death to life. All of that is happening at once, and it feels like you're in this paradox, but it's really almost indescribable.
Oh, thank you, Mike. When I wrote my book and included that chapter about Christ's table, I wrote these words in the prayer. Spirit of life, turn my cynical heart into an instrument of your hope. Turn my weary heart into an instrument of your rest. Transform my anger. Turn around my ambition. Turn my violent heart into an instrument of your peace. Let me hammer away at my self-righteousness and turn it into something life-giving, like a garden tool. I wonder if anybody else has questions for Mike. Mike, thank you so much for coming. His board includes a non-binary person or a trans, I'm not quite sure, and African Americans and both, and evangelicals and liberals and all in between. So I am honored to have you here today, Mike, my brother, and really grateful that you came. Is there anybody who has a question for Mike? Molly, go ahead.
I guess it's not really as much a question as admiration. I work in the public schools, and we're trying to do big pushes towards restorative practice as opposed to suspensions for kids, because it just is so ineffective to just send kids out of the schools when they're committing, acts of sometimes of violence or bullying against each other. And I tend to try to conduct a lot of these sessions along with our principal, and to have it, I know that they've talked about introducing it into the judicial system, but it's always not been the full, the ones I've witnessed have not been the full actual restorative practice. And it's just so refreshing to hear what you're talking about. You're talking my language, so thanks.
It's hard work. Thank you for doing that work to introduce it somewhere. There's so much work in just educating the people you're trying to get to implement it.
Yes, and explaining to like a parent whose child was bullied, how important it is for them to try to come together and understand each other, rather than just get thumb screws and,
yes, exactly.
and torches and pitchforks. So.
Right. Brenda?
Well, not a question so much. Thank you, Mike. Glad you're here and glad I'm part of this. But in the beginning, you said that that you look to restore hearts and something else and cultivate peace. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, that's our mission statement, is to disarm hearts, forge peace, and cultivate justice.
Right. I knew I could find it on your website. I just thought I'd ask again. It's lovely, and we all could take part in all three of those things in our lives somehow.
Thank you.
Hi, Mike.
Oh yeah, Maurice. Kim.
I had a question for you. So you effectively travel to different communities with this activity. Is that correct?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
what kinds of communities have you traveled to and how has it been received?
I'm always going where I'm invited, so it's 99.9% positive when I'm there. It's mostly within my church networks, also to conferences that might be more corporate, not necessarily faith-based. An Interfaith Festival of Faiths conference in Louisville, all those type places. So usually there is some sort of liturgical element, as you might have sensed in a reading call and response that we did earlier. Does that get at your question?
Yes, thank you. Maurice had something too.
So you are a non-for-profit, right?
Correct. Yeah, we're a 501c3.
Do you get funding, any funding from like the Brady bill or anything like that? Is there anything connected to any?
We haven't. The Brady funding, there was just a call that they're getting a lot more of that. We haven't partnered with them as much. We do have a lot of partnerships with organizations like Brady or Mom's Demand or Everytown at a lot of the events that connect to the resources that are working at intersections of gun violence. And advocacy is one of those. We don't do much advocacy ourselves simply because there's so many others doing a great job of it. But we are doing 8 buybacks with Denver and Aurora this year, 4 in each city. The first one will be March 19th at Mile High Stadium. The Broncos are also partnering with us for this, for 1 in Denver and 1 in Aurora. June 11th will be the one that's in Aurora. That site hasn't been totally confirmed yet, but it'll be near the theater where the shooting happened there. And the buybacks are anonymous, so they're their own separate event in the morning, lunchtime. And then after that, we have a sister event where we hear from folks who've been affected by gun violence. Charletta's organization, Colorado Crime Survivors Network, most of the speakers will be coming from there, but there might be some speakers at the different spaces that are hosting them that might be speaking as well. So there will be, I can send Roger when those things are happening if people want to attend, because we'll need volunteers at the buybacks too. While we involve people in making the tools, we also involve people in cutting up the firearms when they come in. So because we facilitate the buyback without the police, we have to cut up the firearm while the donors are present. And that has also been a space for healing for many people who've been affected by gun violence, to be a part of cutting up the firearms.
Are there applications for volunteers online? Is that how?
Next week, I guess this coming week, we will be releasing a link. Sign up to be a part of one of the 8, but it is going out to the host organizations first to sign up and volunteer.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. Just know you have blessed us this morning, and you blessed so many of us in the Front Range and Philly and all the different places you go. Paul, if you're there, I'm going